This is true crime stories for sleep. In the spring of 1897, in the rugged Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti, a boy named Salvatore Lucania was born. The town, like much of Sicily, was marked by hardship, poverty, and a legacy of distrust toward government institutions. The Lucania family lived humbly, part of the vast underclass that worked the land under grueling conditions while dreaming of something more. Sicily had long been a place where survival depended on family loyalty, cunning, and resilience. It was in this environment that Salvatore spent the earliest years of his life, absorbing the values of a world where the law offered little protection and where people learned to rely on themselves and their kin to get by. In 1906, when Salvatore was just 9 years old, his parents, Antonio and Rosalia, decided to leave behind their struggling village and emigrate to the United States. They were part of the massive wave of Italians who fled southern Italy and Sicily in search of opportunity. The Lucania family arrived at Ellis Island with hopes of a better future, joining the growing Italian community in New York City. They settled in the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a neighborhood filled with immigrants from across Europe, Jewish, Irish, Polish, and Italian families all pressed together in poverty, each struggling to carve out a place in America. The Lower East Side was a paradox. On one hand, it was alive with the promise of the New World, bustling markets, diverse cultures, and the possibility of upward mobility. On the other, it was overcrowded, filthy, and dangerous. Crime was rampant, and gangs ruled the streets. For the young Salvatore, now more often called Charlie, the experience of childhood was one of navigating poverty and learning to survive in a neighborhood where toughness often meant the difference between respect and humiliation. It was here, in the back alleys and crowded schoolyards of New York, that the boy began to shape the identity that would eventually transform him into Lucky Luciano. School never held his interest. By the time he was a teenager, he had dropped out and was spending more time on the streets than in classrooms. The Lower East Side was full of young men like him, children of immigrants with little patience for authority, and even less faith in the promises of the American dream. But Luciano stood out. He had an unusual blend of charm, intelligence, and fearlessness that drew others toward him. As a teenager, Luciano began drifting toward the world of gangs. He joined up with local groups of Italian boys, engaging in petty theft, gambling, and extortion. These were small-time crimes, but they provided a taste of power and independence. More importantly, they offered a way to earn money in a city where immigrant families often lived 10 to a room. Luciano quickly proved himself as someone who not only could fight but also think. He had a knack for organization, for commanding loyalty, and for seeing beyond the immediate hustle. It was during these early years that Luciano met Meyer Lansky, a boy of similar age from a Jewish immigrant family. Their meeting, as the story is often told, came when Luciano tried to intimidate Lansky for protection money. Lansky refused, standing his ground. Luciano, rather than taking offense, respected Lansky's courage. From that day on, the two formed a friendship and alliance that would last decades. It was a pivotal moment, the beginnings of a partnership that would later cross ethnic divides and help to build the foundation of modern organized crime in America. At the same time, Luciano began running with one of New York's most notorious gangs, the 5 Points Gang. Led by Paul Kelly, the gang had evolved from a rowdy street outfit into a training ground for future crime bosses. Alumni included Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, men who would go on to dominate organized crime in Chicago. For the teenage Luciano, the 5 Points Gang offered education in discipline, loyalty, and strategy. He learned how to fight, but more importantly, he learned the value of connections, alliances, and the business side of crime. By his late teens, Luciano had already built a reputation on the streets. He dabbled in narcotics, smuggling small quantities of opiates, and discovered how lucrative the trade could be. He was arrested multiple times for theft and possession but managed to avoid long sentences, either through lack of evidence or sheer luck. It was during this period that he began to acquire the nickname, Lucky. Some said it was because of his uncanny ability to avoid convictions. Others believed it stemmed from an incident in which he survived a brutal beating and stabbing attempt. Whatever the origin, the name stuck, and it fit the image of a young man who seemed destined to escape dangers that consumed others. Unlike many of the older Italian gangsters who clung to rigid traditions and distrusted outsiders, Luciano showed an unusual pragmatism. He was willing to work with anyone, Italians, Jews, Irish, as long as there was profit to be made. This approach set him apart in a criminal underworld that often operated along strict ethnic lines. To Luciano, money spoke louder than bloodlines, and efficiency mattered more than outdated codes of honor. His world began to expand further when he came under the influence of Arnold Rothstein, one of the most powerful racketeers in New York. Rothstein was a gambler, fixer, and businessman who had already made his fortune in the criminal underworld. More importantly, he had a vision for crime that went beyond street fights and petty hustles. Rothstein saw crime as an enterprise, one that could be structured, rationalized, and operated like a business. For Luciano, Rothstein became a mentor, showing him how to think strategically, how to bribe officials, and how to turn vice into a well-oiled machine. This mentorship came at a critical moment. The United States was about to undergo one of the most transformative social experiments in its history: Prohibition. In 1919, the Volstead Act was passed, outlawing the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol. For millions of Americans, the demand for liquor did not disappear, it intensified. The new law created an enormous black market, and men like Luciano were positioned perfectly to take advantage of it. By the early 1920s, Luciano was in his early 20s, with connections that stretched across Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs. He had already begun to build a reputation as a reliable, ambitious, and forward-thinking figure in the underworld. Bootlegging offered opportunities unlike anything before. The profits were astronomical, and the need for organization, supply chains, and distribution networks played directly to Luciano's strengths. But in these early years, he was still climbing. The Sicilian bosses of New York, men like Giuseppe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, controlled much of the Italian underworld, adhering to the old-world structures of loyalty and secrecy. Luciano worked under them, learning the dynamics of power while quietly forming his own vision of a new kind of organization. He respected the traditions of the old bosses but saw them as relics, clinging to rituals that slowed progress. In his mind, the future of organized crime lay not in feuds over honor, but in efficiency, profits, and alliances that transcended old ethnic boundaries. The boy born in Sicily, raised in the tenements of New York, and hardened on the streets of the Lower East Side was no longer just another immigrant hustler. He was becoming a man with ambition far greater than those around him, a man who would soon reshape the criminal underworld into a national syndicate. The foundation had been laid, the friendships, the mentorship, the lessons learned in survival. All that remained was the opportunity to seize the moment, and with Prohibition unfolding, that moment was close at hand. By the time the First World War drew to a close in 1918, Charles Lucky Luciano was no longer just another streetwise teenager from the Lower East Side. He was in his early 20s, hardened by years of running rackets, arrests, and alliances, and already beginning to carve out a reputation that would carry him to the very top of organized crime in America. What distinguished him at this stage was not only his survival instinct but his vision. While many of his contemporaries thought only in terms of quick money and immediate survival, Luciano understood that the underworld was on the cusp of transformation. Prohibition, which would soon arrive, was going to reshape everything, and he intended to be ready. During these years, Luciano continued to operate in the Lower East Side and Manhattan, moving between petty rackets and the networks of the Five Points Gang. Arrests were frequent but rarely catastrophic. Between 1916 and 1920, he was picked up by police on multiple occasions, for illegal gambling, narcotics possession, and petty theft, but each time he managed to avoid serious prison time. Whether through lack of evidence, bribed officials, or simply his own luck, he remained free. The name, Lucky, began to circulate more widely, attached to his uncanny ability to escape the long arm of the law. It was in this period that he deepened his ties with Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Together, they formed a trio of ambitious young men, each with different strengths. Lansky was analytical, cautious, and brilliant with numbers. Siegel was bold, fearless, and had a natural instinct for violence. Luciano balanced both qualities with charm and strategic vision. What made their partnership unique was its disregard for the ethnic divides that had long shaped organized crime. At a time when Italians stuck with Italians and Jews stuck with Jews, Luciano and Lansky forged a bond that crossed those lines. The alliance would later become the cornerstone of the national syndicate Luciano dreamed of creating. Meanwhile, Luciano's exposure to narcotics deepened. He had been experimenting with small-time heroin and opium distribution since his teenage years, and by the early 1920s, he was running operations that supplied local dealers. It was a lucrative trade, though one that carried risks even greater than bootlegging would. The authorities were far more aggressive in pursuing narcotics violations than alcohol-related offenses. Still, Luciano learned valuable lessons in supply chains, international contacts, and the profitability of addictive substances. Later in life, he would distance himself publicly from narcotics, recognizing how politically dangerous the business was, but these early years gave him a first-hand education in its potential. His world changed dramatically in 1919, when the Volstead Act went into effect, enforcing prohibition across the United States. Overnight, alcohol, a staple of American social life, became contraband. Bars closed, distilleries shut down, and yet the thirst for liquor remained insatiable. This was the moment Luciano had been waiting for. Along with his allies, he began positioning himself within the networks that would smuggle, distribute, and sell illegal alcohol on a massive scale. At first, the business was chaotic. Dozens of gangs competed for territory, hijacked shipments, and fought violent battles over speakeasies. But Luciano approached the problem differently. He began thinking about efficiency, about organization, and about how to minimize bloodshed while maximizing profits. To him, constant gang wars were bad for business. They attracted attention from the police, disrupted supply chains, and wasted resources. He looked for models of cooperation and stability, and he found them in men like Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein, already notorious as the gambler who had allegedly fixed the 1919 World Series, was a master organizer of vice. He taught Luciano that crime could be managed like a corporation, with structure, hierarchy, and careful investment. Luciano absorbed these lessons eagerly. Rothstein provided financing, advice, and introductions to key contacts in smuggling networks, including suppliers in Canada and beyond. Under Rothstein's guidance, Luciano began to see the possibilities of transforming street-level rackets into a streamlined business empire. By the early 1920s, Luciano had established himself as a key player in Manhattan's underworld. His charisma and pragmatism set him apart from the older generation of Italian bosses, many of whom still operated according to strict Sicilian codes of loyalty and tradition. Men like Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masuria demanded blind allegiance and valued honor over efficiency. Luciano, though respectful of these traditions, believed they held back progress. To him, the future belonged to those who could adapt, who could blend old-world networks with new-world ambition. It was also during this time that Luciano began cultivating political connections. Bribery became second nature, and he quickly learned that police officers, judges, and politicians could be bought as easily as bootleg whiskey. This ability to grease the wheels of authority became one of his greatest assets, allowing him to operate with a sense of invulnerability. He also understood the importance of public image. Unlike some gangsters who flaunted their violence, Luciano cultivated an air of sophistication. He dressed sharply, frequented nightclubs, and carried himself with the demeanor of a businessman rather than a street thug. Violence, however, was never far away. In 1923, Luciano survived one of the most notorious incidents of his early career. After a night of gambling and drinking, he was kidnapped by a group of men, possibly rivals, possibly corrupt police officers, who beat him savagely, stabbed him, and left him for dead on Staten Island beach. Somehow he survived, scarred but alive. His right eye drooped permanently, and his face bore the marks of the attack for the rest of his life. The incident only enhanced his reputation. To his associates, it was proof that Lucky Luciano truly was untouchable, a man who could endure brutal violence and come back stronger. The attack also reinforced Luciano's determination. He became more cautious, more calculating, and more committed to his vision of building something larger than himself. The 1920s were a time of both opportunity and danger in New York's criminal underworld. The profits from bootlegging were enormous, but the competition was fierce. Irish gangs, Jewish gangs, and Italian mafia families all vied for control. Luciano positioned himself carefully, working under Mafia while maintaining friendships and alliances outside the Italian fold. By the mid-1920s, Luciano was one of the most visible young figures in organized crime. He had wealth, influence, and a growing crew of loyal associates. Yet he was still, at this stage, a lieutenant rather than a boss. Mafia held the reins of the Italian underworld in Manhattan, and Salvatore Maranzano loomed as another powerful contender. Luciano was content to bide his time, learning from both men while quietly preparing for the moment when he could reshape the landscape entirely. His closest friendships, with Lansky, Siegel, and Rothstein, gave him a broader perspective than most Italian mobsters of the era. While others focused narrowly on ethnic loyalty, Luciano envisioned an organization that would cross boundaries, uniting Italians, Jews, and even Irish criminals under a single cooperative structure. It was a radical idea, one that would eventually become reality in the form of the National Crime Syndicate. But in the early 1920s, it was still just a vision. The combination of luck, intelligence, and resilience had carried Luciano through the turbulent years of his youth and into the first stage of real power. He had survived beatings, arrests, and betrayals. He had learned from the best, from street gangs to master racketeers. And with Prohibition fueling a criminal boom unlike anything the United States had ever seen, he was poised to take the next step. By the middle of the 1920s, Charles, Lucky, Luciano had firmly entrenched himself within the fabric of New York's underworld. Prohibition was in full swing, and with it came unimaginable profits for anyone bold and ruthless enough to seize them. Luciano had already demonstrated his ability to blend charm with calculation, forging alliances that transcended old-world traditions. Now, as he entered his late 20s, he found himself moving into the center of power, serving as a rising lieutenant under Giuseppe Joe the Boss Mafia while quietly plotting for something greater. Mafia controlled much of the Italian underworld in Manhattan. He was not a visionary. He was a traditionalist who believed in ruling through brute force, loyalty, and fear. To men like Mafia, the Mafia was an extension of Sicily, steeped in its codes of silence and insularity. Luciano, however, represented a different kind of thinking. He was Sicilian by birth, but he had grown up on the streets of New York. He saw crime as a business, not as a matter of Sicilian honor, and he was convinced that cooperation with non-Italians was the key to building an empire. Luciano outwardly remained loyal to Mafia, serving as a trusted operative and helping to manage bootlegging routes, speakeasies, and distribution networks. But beneath the surface, he was already aligning himself with a different vision of the future. His friendships with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel flourished during this time, and together they began orchestrating ventures that brought together Jewish and Italian criminals. They controlled supply chains of Canadian whiskey, smuggled through the Great Lakes and down into New York, and they reinvested their profits into nightclubs and gambling operations. Luciano, more than anyone, was becoming the bridge between two worlds. The mid-1920s also brought Luciano into the orbit of another powerful figure, Salvatore Maranzano. Unlike Mafia, Maranzano was a recent arrival from Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, and he carried himself with the bearing of an old-world don. He admired Roman history, often comparing himself to Julius Caesar, and he envisioned reshaping the American Mafia in his image. At first, Maranzano and Mafia coexisted uneasily, but the stage was set for conflict. When the time came, Luciano would be caught between them, and would ultimately determine the outcome of their war. Meanwhile, Luciano's own reputation continued to grow. He was arrested several times between 1925 and 1927, usually on charges related to bootlegging or gambling, but he always managed to escape long sentences. Bribes, legal maneuvering, and sheer luck seemed to protect him. Each brush with the law only enhanced his standing. Police reports from the era described him as one of the rising stars of organized crime, a man whose influence stretched beyond his Italian roots. He was no longer just a street tough, he was a businessman in the making, with a network that spanned multiple boroughs and ethnic groups. The balance of power in New York began to shift in 1928 and 1929. Bootlegging profits were soaring, but so were tensions among rival factions. Masuria's heavy-handed tactics alienated many of his associates, while Maranzano quietly recruited followers, particularly among Sicilian immigrants from Castellamare. The two men represented competing visions of leadership, Masuria's brute force against Maranzano's old-world discipline. Luciano found himself in the middle, and for a time, he managed to play both sides, feigning loyalty to Masuria while maintaining communication with Maranzano. It was around this time that Luciano's alliances with non-Italians drew increasing suspicion. Traditional bosses disliked his closeness with Lansky and Siegel, viewing it as a betrayal of Sicilian purity. Luciano shrugged off their criticism. To him, Lansky was indispensable, a strategist who understood numbers and organization in ways that old dons could not. Siegel, meanwhile, provided muscle and fearlessness. Luciano's refusal to be bound by ethnic loyalty would eventually transform the Mafia into a national syndicate, but in the late 1920s, it also placed him in dangerous territory. In 1929, Luciano attended a pivotal meeting in Atlantic City, sometimes referred to as the Atlantic City Conference. Hosted by Meyer Lansky, it brought together leading figures of organized crime from across the country, including Al Capone of Chicago. The gathering aimed to reduce gang warfare and encourage cooperation in bootlegging operations. For Luciano, the conference confirmed his belief that crime could be run like an industry, with territories, agreements, and partnerships replacing constant bloodshed. The older bosses were largely absent, dismissing such ideas, but Luciano left Atlantic City more convinced than ever that he represented the future. Later that same year, however, Luciano's life was nearly cut short once again. In October 1929, he was abducted by 4 men, beaten savagely, and stabbed multiple times before being dumped on a Staten Island beach. The reasons behind the attack remain unclear. Some historians suggest rival gangsters wanted him out of the way. Others believe corrupt cops were responsible. Whatever the truth, Luciano survived, scarred but alive. His right eye drooped permanently, giving him a menacing appearance, but the incident only enhanced his aura of resilience. People whispered that nothing could kill Lucky Luciano, and the name, Lucky, stuck even more firmly than before. As the decade turned into the 1930s, tensions between Masuria and Maranzano boiled over into open warfare. Known as the Castellamarese War, it pitted Masuria's forces against Maranzano's in a bloody struggle for control of New York's underworld. Shootings, ambushes, and assassinations became routine, and both sides suffered heavy losses. For Luciano, the war presented both danger and opportunity. Outwardly, he remained Masuria's loyal lieutenant, but privately, he began to plot a different course. He understood that neither Masuria nor Maranzano truly embodied the future he envisioned. Masuria was too crude, too resistant to change, while Maranzano was too rigidly tied to old-world traditions. Luciano, by contrast, wanted a modern syndicate, one that would bring together Italians, Jews, and others in a cooperative, business-like structure. The war provided the perfect backdrop for him to make his move. Throughout 1930, Luciano carefully maneuvered between the two camps, gathering intelligence and cultivating allies. He used Lansky as a sounding board, discussing plans that went far beyond mere survival. What if both Masuria and Maranzano were eliminated? What if the old guard was swept aside, leaving room for a new, younger leadership? Such thoughts were dangerous, bordering on treason, but Luciano's ambition was boundless. By 1931, The war had dragged on for nearly 2 years, and exhaustion was setting in. Bloodshed had destabilized the underworld, and profits were slipping. Bootlegging routes were disrupted, and law enforcement was paying closer attention. Luciano knew the time had come to act. If he wanted to reshape the Mafia into a modern organization, he would have to make a decisive move against the old bosses. The stage was set for betrayal. Luciano had risen from a teenage street hustler to a central figure in one of the most violent underworld conflicts in American history. He had played both sides skillfully, surviving kidnappings, attacks, and police scrutiny. But now, with Masuria and Maranzano locked in a war that threatened to destroy everything, Luciano prepared to tip the balance, and in doing so, to claim power for himself. The Castellamarese War raged on through 1930 and into 1931, tearing New York's underworld apart with a relentless cycle of ambushes, betrayals, and bloodshed. At its core, the war was a struggle between Joe, the boss, Masuria, the entrenched ruler of the city's Italian underworld, and Salvatore Maranzano, the Castellamarese upstart who sought to wrest control away. For Charles, Lucky, Luciano, the war was not merely a conflict to be survived but an opportunity to reshape the Mafia into something entirely new. Masuria's forces remained formidable at the start. He commanded loyalty from longtime Sicilian associates, and wielded fear like a weapon. Yet his grip was loosening. The endless violence drained his organization of men and money, and many began to question whether Masuria had the vision to lead them into the future. Luciano had served Masuria faithfully, overseeing bootlegging routes, gambling rackets, and enforcement squads, but he watched carefully as his boss's authority slipped away. To Luciano, Masuria was a relic of the old world, a man unable to adapt to the new realities of organized crime. On the other side, Salvatore Maranzano presented himself as a disciplined, calculating alternative. He admired Julius Caesar and spoke often of Roman order, envisioning a criminal empire that would mirror the legions of antiquity. Yet Maranzano, too, clung to old Sicilian customs, demanding loyalty above all else and enforcing rigid hierarchies. For Luciano, Maranzano's vision was little better than Masuria's. Both men represented extremes of the past, and neither could build the kind of syndicate he imagined. The year 1930 saw escalating violence. Gunfights erupted in the streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn, and bombings claimed the lives of rivals and innocents alike. The newspapers dubbed it the Italian Gang War, sensationalizing each killing and fueling public outrage. Police crackdowns followed, but arrests rarely stuck, as witnesses vanished and juries were intimidated. Luciano maneuvered carefully, ensuring he remained useful to Masuria while quietly cultivating connections with Maranzano's camp. His friendships with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel also remained vital, as they helped him secure profits and protection beyond the reach of the warring Sicilians. By early 1931, the war reached a stalemate. Neither Masuria nor Maranzano could deliver a decisive blow, and both sides were hemorrhaging resources. Luciano recognized the futility of the conflict. To continue fighting would mean mutual destruction, but to end it would require bold action. He began to consider an option that few dared to entertain, eliminating both leaders and seizing control himself. The first step would be to rid himself of Masuria. Luciano had served Joe the Boss for years, rising under his protection, but loyalty in the underworld was never absolute. Masuria had grown paranoid, suspicious of Luciano's dealings with outsiders, and increasingly erratic in his demands. Luciano knew that remaining aligned with Masuria meant a slow march toward ruin. He opened secret negotiations with Maranzano, proposing a deal. If Luciano betrayed Masuria, Maranzano would recognize him as a key lieutenant in the new order. The plan was set into motion in the spring of 1931. Luciano invited Masuria to a Coney Island restaurant for a meeting on April 15th. The two dined together, playing cards and sharing drinks, while Luciano's men waited nearby. At the agreed moment, Luciano excused himself, stepping outside for a cigarette. In his absence, four gunmen stormed in: Benjamin, Bugsy, Siegel, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis. They opened fire, riddling Mafia with bullets and leaving him slumped over the card table. Luciano returned to the scene shortly after, calm and collected, signaling that the reign of Joe the Boss had come to a bloody end. With Mafia gone, Maranzano emerged victorious in the Castellammarese War. He declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, and began restructuring the Mafia according to his vision. He divided New York's underworld into 5 families, each with its own hierarchy, and positioned himself as the supreme authority over them all. Luciano was rewarded for his betrayal with control of his own family, but the arrangement left him uneasy. Maranzano's victory had solved one problem only to create another. Maranzano sought to impose absolute control, treating his fellow bosses as subordinates and demanding tributes that reflected his self-image as a Caesar-like ruler. He filled key positions with loyalists from Castellammare, sidelining men he distrusted. To Luciano, it was clear that Maranzano was simply another tyrant, one who clung to outdated traditions and refused to recognize the benefits of modernizing the organization. Even worse, whispers spread that Maranzano planned to eliminate Luciano himself, fearing his ambition and his closeness to non-Italians. By the summer of 1931, Luciano understood that his survival depended on striking first. He confided in Lansky, who agreed that Maranzano's reign could not last. The two men began plotting Maranzano's downfall, but unlike the crude ambush that felled Mafia, they envisioned something cleaner, more efficient, and more modern. Luciano wanted to send a message that the era of bloody street wars and old world dominance was over, and a new order was beginning. On September 10, 1931, Luciano made his move. Maranzano had summoned him to his Manhattan office under the pretense of discussing business. Luciano knew it was a trap, that Maranzano intended to have him killed that day, but instead of walking blindly into the snare, Luciano acted first. He sent in a team of Jewish hitmen, disguised as government agents, to storm the office. They disarmed Maranzano's guards, cornered the boss, and stabbed and shot him to death. The killing was swift and clinical, a stark contrast to the chaos that had characterized the Castellammarese War. With Maranzano gone, Luciano stood unchallenged. He abolished the title of boss of bosses, recognizing that such a role only bred resentment and conflict. Instead, he established the Commission, a governing body composed of the leaders of New York's 5 families along with representatives from Chicago and Buffalo. The Commission would resolve disputes, coordinate national operations, and maintain balance among the families. It was a revolutionary idea, one that transformed the Mafia from a loose collection of gangs into a true syndicate. Luciano's rise marked the dawn of a new era. He had survived the brutal war between Mafia and Maranzano not by brute force alone but through cunning, alliances, and a willingness to defy tradition. He now stood as the architect of modern organized crime in America, a man who blended the ruthlessness of the old Mafia with the pragmatism of the new. The bloody lessons of the Castellammarese War had reshaped his vision, convincing him that cooperation and structure, not endless violence, were the keys to lasting power. Yet even as Luciano celebrated his triumph, challenges loomed on the horizon. The Great Depression was deepening, and while Prohibition still generated immense profits, the political winds were shifting. Law enforcement was beginning to adapt, and reformers were calling for tougher measures against organized crime. Luciano's reign had only just begun, but he would soon discover that building an empire was one thing, and holding it together in the face of constant threats was another. The fall of Salvatore Maranzano in September 1931 left Charles, lucky, Luciano at the height of his power. In just over a year, he had survived the bloodletting of the Castellammarese War, orchestrated the betrayal of Joe Mafia, and engineered the downfall of Maranzano, the so-called boss of all bosses. What emerged from the chaos was something unprecedented in American organized crime, a new system, designed not around the whims of one supreme leader but around a collective body of bosses that would balance interests and prevent future wars. Luciano was now the undisputed architect of this transformation, and the underworld had entered a new age. The structure Luciano envisioned came to life in the form of the Commission. Each of the New York Mafia families, which Maranzano had codified just months earlier, now had a recognized boss who would sit at the table. Alongside Luciano himself, there was Joe Bonanno, Joe Prophesy, Vincent Mangano, and Tom Gagliano. Beyond New York, Alabama Capone's Chicago outfit and Stefano Megadino's Buffalo family were also given seats. The commission's purpose was to mediate disputes, approve new bosses, and coordinate national operations so that the destructive turf wars of the past would not be repeated. Luciano understood that perpetual bloodshed was bad for business, and he was determined to place profits above pride. This was a radical departure from the old world traditions of the Sicilian Mafia. In Sicily, power flowed from rigid hierarchies and blood oaths, often culminating in endless feuds. Luciano saw no value in such practices. He insisted on pragmatism, professionalism, and above all, cooperation. The commission was not about friendship or loyalty in the old sense. It was about balancing power and ensuring everyone made money. In doing so, Luciano effectively transformed the Mafia from a loose confederation of street gangs into a modern, national syndicate. But structure was only the first step. Luciano also sought to expand the reach of organized crime beyond bootlegging, which had been its lifeblood during Prohibition. With the early 1930s well underway, the federal government was beginning to shift its stance on alcohol. The push for repeal was gaining momentum, and it became clear to Luciano that the days of immense profits from illegal liquor were numbered. He was determined to prepare for life after Prohibition. Prostitution, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, these became the new frontiers. Luciano placed particular emphasis on prostitution, not because he considered it glamorous but because he saw it as a steady, reliable stream of income that could be organized on a massive scale. Where others viewed prostitution as a chaotic street business, Luciano envisioned it as an industry that could be managed, regulated, and controlled like any other. He worked closely with his trusted allies, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Bugsy Siegel, to establish networks of brothels in New York and beyond, ensuring that profits flowed consistently into his coffers. Gambling was another pillar. Bookmaking on horse races and numbers running in poor neighborhoods became major revenue streams. Luciano was pragmatic in his approach, recognizing that gambling appealed to a broad spectrum of society, from wealthy bettors in racetracks to working-class players in Harlem. He was equally savvy in labor racketeering, infiltrating unions and using their power to extort businesses, control contracts, and generate steady income. With Costello's political connections, Luciano's influence stretched deep into the corridors of labor and politics, ensuring that strikes could be manufactured or prevented depending on who paid the right price. Perhaps Luciano's most significant achievement during this period was forging alliances beyond the Italian underworld. He had long believed in working with Jewish and Irish gangs, a stance that had earned him suspicion under Masuria and Maranzano. Now, free of their constraints, he could put his philosophy into full practice. His closest confidant remained Meyer Lansky, who brought financial acumen and a network of Jewish associates that complemented Luciano's own. Together, they ensured that business was conducted efficiently and profits were maximized. These alliances extended to Arnold Rothstein's successors in the Jewish underworld and Irish figures in labor racketeering. Luciano's openness to collaboration made him unique among mafia bosses of his time, and it allowed him to expand his reach far beyond the insular networks of Sicilian tradition. The result was a truly American syndicate, diverse, pragmatic, and adaptable. By 1933, Luciano's foresight paid off. Prohibition was repealed with the ratification of the 21st Amendment. For many in the underworld, this spelled disaster. Bootlegging had been the cornerstone of their wealth, and its sudden legalization threatened to collapse entire empires. But Luciano had already diversified. While others scrambled to adapt, he simply shifted more resources into his other enterprises, ensuring that his revenues continued to climb. He was no longer dependent on any single racket. He had built a diversified empire capable of withstanding change. Still, with great power came great visibility. Luciano became a target not only for rival gangsters but for law enforcement and reformers determined to curb organized crime. One of his most persistent adversaries was Thomas E. Dewey, a young and ambitious prosecutor in New York who was building his reputation by taking on mobsters. Dewey focused particularly on vice operations, and Luciano's growing role in prostitution made him a tempting target. For now, Luciano remained insulated, his political connections and careful bribes keeping him one step ahead of investigators. But the attention foreshadowed battles yet to come. During this period, Luciano also cultivated an image that reflected his success. He dressed impeccably, frequented nightclubs, and mingled with entertainers, politicians, and businessmen. Unlike Capone, whose flamboyance drew constant scrutiny, Luciano preferred a quieter form of display. He wanted to be seen as sophisticated, someone who belonged among the elites of New York society. Yet behind the tailored suits and polished manners, his power rested on ruthlessness. Those who crossed him met swift ends, often disappearing without a trace. The facade of respectability masked a core of violence and control that ensured his authority was never questioned. The mid-1930s also saw Luciano's influence extend beyond New York. Through the Commission, he had a say in national matters, from Chicago to Los Angeles. His partnership with Lansky facilitated investments in Havana, where gambling operations began to flourish under the more relaxed oversight of Cuban authorities. These early ventures laid the groundwork for what would become a major mafia stronghold in the years to come. Luciano was thinking not just locally but internationally, recognizing that organized crime could transcend borders and operate like a multinational corporation. Yet beneath the surface of this success, seeds of vulnerability were being planted. Luciano's reliance on prostitution as a major income source made him particularly exposed to reformers like Dewey, who saw vice as both immoral and politically useful to attack. Moreover, the violence inherent in maintaining control over brothels, gambling dens, and unions created enemies both inside and outside the underworld. Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to manage these conflicts, but the pressures were mounting. For now, though, he stood unchallenged. The Commission was functioning, disputes were resolved without large-scale wars, and profits poured in from a wide range of rackets. Luciano had not only survived the tumult of the early 1930s but emerged as the most powerful crime boss in America. To his allies, he was a visionary who had brought order to chaos. To his enemies, he was a dangerous figure whose reach seemed limitless. To the public, he was a shadowy presence, whispered about but rarely seen, the man who had quietly reshaped the American underworld into something far larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. What Luciano could not foresee, however, was that his very innovations would make him a prime target for reformers eager to make their mark. The same system that gave him strength also gave law enforcement a clear focus, and the man who had built the Commission, modernized the Mafia, and created a national syndicate would soon find himself at the center of one of the most aggressive prosecutions in American criminal history. By the mid-1930s, Charles Lucky Luciano had achieved what no other gangster in America had managed before. He had transformed the Mafia from a chaotic patchwork of rival gangs into a streamlined national syndicate. His creation of the Commission provided order where once there had been endless blood feuds, and his diversification into gambling, labor racketeering, and prostitution ensured that profits remained steady even after Prohibition ended. But as Luciano's power grew, so too did the forces arrayed against him. The underworld had always been a target for law enforcement, but now reformers and prosecutors, eager to make names for themselves, began setting their sights squarely on him. Chief among these was Thomas E. Dewey, a relentless prosecutor who believed that organized crime could be dismantled if its leaders were brought down. Dewey had already gained attention for his pursuit of racketeers in the early 1930s, but by 1935, he turned his attention directly to vice in New York City. He reasoned that if he could prove that Luciano was the hidden force behind the city's extensive prostitution rings, he would not only remove a powerful crime boss but also strike at the financial core of organized crime. Luciano's empire of prostitution was vast, though carefully hidden. Through a network of intermediaries and trusted lieutenants, he oversaw hundreds of brothels across New York. The profits, collected in small increments from countless establishments, funneled upward until they reached Luciano and his closest associates. To shield himself, Luciano never dealt directly with brothel operators. Instead, he relied on figures like Dave Batillo, a trusted enforcer, and others who managed the day-to-day operations. This insulation was deliberate, a layer of protection designed to make it difficult for prosecutors to connect him to the business. But Dewey was undeterred. He launched a sweeping investigation, employing undercover agents and pressuring lower-level pimps and prostitutes into testifying. Over time, a pattern emerged, pointing to an organized system far beyond mere street-level vice. Witnesses claimed that Luciano not only sanctioned the operations but personally reaped the profits. These testimonies would prove crucial, though their reliability would later be fiercely debated. In 1936, Dewey made his move. On the night of April 1st, Luciano was arrested in Hot Springs, Arkansas, a popular resort town where he had been vacationing. Local police, acting on Dewey's orders, picked him up without incident. Luciano attempted to use his influence to avoid extradition, even offering bribes to local officials, but Dewey's reach proved greater. After a series of legal maneuvers failed, Luciano was sent back to New York to face trial. The arrest shocked both the underworld and the public. Luciano had long been a shadowy figure, known to exist but rarely touched by the law. His capture represented a dramatic escalation in the battle between organized crime and reformers. For Dewey, it was a golden opportunity, a chance to demonstrate that even the most powerful mobster could be brought down. For Luciano, it was the beginning of a fight not only for his freedom but for the very survival of the empire he had built. The trial began in May 1936, and it quickly became a sensation. Newspapers covered every detail, painting Luciano as the mastermind of a sprawling prostitution racket that degraded the city's morals. Dewey stood at the center of the spectacle, his sharp questioning and theatrical presentation captivating the jury and the public alike. He presented witness after witness, mostly prostitutes and pimps, who testified that Luciano's men collected payments and reported directly to him. Some claimed they had even seen Luciano in person, giving orders. Luciano's defense, led by attorney George Morton Levy, argued that the testimonies were unreliable, given under pressure or in exchange for leniency. Luciano himself denied involvement, insisting that he had no connection to the prostitution trade. He portrayed himself as a gambler and businessman, not a pimp. But the jury was unconvinced. The sheer weight of testimony, combined with Dewey's skill in presenting a narrative of organized vice, proved overwhelming. On June 7, 1936, the jury returned its verdict, guilty. Luciano was convicted on 62 counts related to compulsory prostitution. The judge sentenced him to a staggering 30 to 50 years in prison, a sentence designed not only to punish him but to send a message to others in the underworld. For Dewey, it was a triumphant moment, cementing his reputation as a crime-busting prosecutor and propelling him toward future political success. For Luciano, it was a devastating blow. The conviction represented more than just the loss of freedom. It symbolized the end of an era. Luciano had believed that his insulation, his careful layers of protection, would shield him from direct prosecution. But Dewey had demonstrated that even indirect control could be enough to bring down a mob boss. In the wake of the trial, other gangsters began to take note, adjusting their operations to avoid the same fate. Luciano was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a grim, fortress-like prison in upstate New York. There, the man who had once ruled the underworld found himself confined behind bars, stripped of the wealth and influence that had defined his life. Yet even in prison, Luciano remained a figure of authority. He communicated with his associates through visitors and intermediaries, continuing to exert influence over the Mafia. His conviction had weakened him but had not eliminated his presence in the underworld. Back on the streets, leadership shifted. Frank Costello, Luciano's trusted ally, assumed a more prominent role in managing the family's operations. Costello's style was different, less violent, more political, but he ensured that the family continued to thrive. Meanwhile, the commission remained intact, functioning as Luciano had intended, even without him at its helm. This was perhaps his greatest legacy, a system that could endure beyond the presence of any single boss. The case against Luciano, however, remained controversial. Many historians and legal scholars later argued that the evidence against him was thin, based largely on coerced or incentivized testimony. Some believed that Dewey had targeted Luciano not because of solid proof but because he needed a high-profile conviction to advance his career. Luciano himself always maintained his innocence, insisting that he had never been involved in prostitution at all. Whether or not that was true, the perception was enough to secure his downfall. For Luciano, prison life was an adjustment. He was allowed certain privileges due to his status, but he also endured the harsh conditions of Dannemora, a place notorious for its isolation and severity. Still, his mind remained active, and his connections ensured that he was never entirely cut off from the world he had helped shape. Letters, coded messages, and trusted visitors kept him informed of developments outside. He remained, in many ways, the invisible hand guiding his family, even from behind bars. Yet the world was changing rapidly. The Great Depression continued to strain the nation, and law enforcement grew more sophisticated in its fight against organized crime. International tensions were escalating as the 1930s drew to a close, and the Mafia's role in the broader world was about to take an unexpected turn. Luciano, confined but not forgotten, would soon find himself at the center of events that would intertwine organized crime with global conflict in ways no one could have predicted. When Charles, Lucky, Luciano was led through the iron gates of Clinton Correctional Facility in 1936, many assumed his reign as America's most influential gangster had come to an abrupt and permanent end. Convicted on charges of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 30 to 50 years, he was locked away in a prison notorious for its harsh conditions. To prosecutors and reformers, this was a decisive victory, proof that the Mafia could be toppled by law and order. Yet Luciano's imprisonment did not mean his influence vanished. In fact, as the years went by, the world outside his cell shifted in ways that would draw him back into relevance, especially during the upheaval of the Second World War. Clinton Prison, often called Little Siberia, was a far cry from Luciano's lavish Manhattan lifestyle. Located in Dannemora, New York, the prison was a bleak fortress surrounded by cold forests and stone walls. Inside, conditions were Spartan, cells barely large enough for a bed and toilet, strict daily routines, and constant surveillance. Luciano, accustomed to silk suits and nightclubs, was now issued coarse prison garb and expected to follow the same rules as any other inmate. Yet even here, his reputation as a Mafia boss gave him an aura of authority. Guards and fellow prisoners alike knew who he was. Some feared him, others sought his favor, but almost everyone respected his status. Though stripped of direct control, Luciano still maintained a line of communication to the outside. Trusted intermediaries carried messages, sometimes through visitors, sometimes through coded letters. The Mafia's commission, the governing body he had created, remained operational. Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky stepped into more prominent roles, ensuring the family's rackets continued smoothly. Luciano's imprisonment became less of an ending than a shift in leadership. The syndicate ran without him day to day, but its foundations were his design. Meanwhile, the world beyond Clinton Prison was sliding toward global war. In Europe, the rise of fascism and Adolf Hitler's aggression destabilized the continent. By 1939, Germany had invaded Poland, and World War II was underway. The United States initially tried to remain neutral, but by December 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the country was fully at war. The U.S. military mobilized on an unprecedented scale, and New York City became a critical hub for shipping troops and supplies overseas. This is where Luciano's story re-entered the national spotlight. New York Harbor, one of the busiest in the world, was vital to the war effort. But it was also vulnerable. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant vessels and threatening supply lines. Rumors circulated that Axis agents might sabotage docks and warehouses. The U.S. Navy, aware of these risks, began searching for ways to secure the waterfront. It was Meyer Lansky, Luciano's old ally, who first suggested a solution. Lansky had long maintained ties with the Navy through informal contacts. He proposed that organized crime, specifically Luciano's syndicate, could help protect the docks. After all, the Mafia had deep influence over the longshoremen's unions and stevedores who worked the piers. If the Navy needed eyes and ears on the waterfront, the mob was uniquely positioned to provide them. The idea gained traction after a mysterious incident in February 1942. The French luxury liner Normandy, which had been seized by U.S. authorities and renamed the USS Lafayette, caught fire while docked in New York Harbor. The blaze gutted the ship, and though official reports attributed the disaster to an accident, many feared it had been sabotage. The Navy, alarmed by the possibility of Axis infiltration, became desperate for a solution. Operation Underworld was born. Quietly, the Office of Naval Intelligence reached out to Lansky, who in turn opened discussions with Luciano. The plan was simple but extraordinary. In exchange for cooperation with the government, Luciano would receive preferential treatment in prison and perhaps eventual consideration for parole. The Mafia would ensure security on the docks, monitor for sabotage, and assist with intelligence gathering. Luciano agreed. The arrangement was controversial, shrouded in secrecy at the time. Officially, the Navy denied working with criminals, but behind the scenes, Luciano's network became an asset. Longshoremen were instructed to report suspicious activity, and mobsters ensured that Nazi sympathizers or saboteurs would not gain a foothold. Lansky, ever pragmatic, coordinated much of the effort, using Luciano's name to guarantee compliance. The mob had effectively become an arm of wartime security. Luciano's cooperation extended beyond the docks. When Allied forces prepared to invade Sicily in 1943, American intelligence sought assistance in navigating the island's terrain and connecting with locals. Again, Luciano's influence proved useful. The Mafia had deep roots in Sicily, and contacts there could provide valuable information. Reports suggest that Luciano facilitated connections between U.S. operatives and Sicilian mafiosi, easing the Allied landings during Operation Husky. While the extent of his role remains debated, some historians argue it was exaggerated. The perception of his usefulness was undeniable. Back in Clinton prison, Luciano's conditions improved markedly. Though still confined, he received privileges uncommon for other inmates. Visitors came frequently, bringing him updates on both the Mafia's affairs and the progress of the war. Guards looked the other way as he received better food, clothing, and even alcohol. For a man supposedly serving decades behind bars, his experience was closer to that of a confined statesman than a common criminal. The war years highlighted the strange duality of Luciano's life. On one hand, he was a convicted felon, condemned by the courts as a corrupter of morals. On the other, he was quietly assisting the U.S. government in a time of national crisis. The same system that had sought to bury him was now, out of necessity, relying on his network to safeguard the nation's security. It was a paradox that suited Luciano perfectly, proof that his reach extended even beyond prison walls. By 1945, the war was drawing to a close. Germany surrendered in May, and Japan followed in August after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Allied victory was celebrated across the United States, and attention turned back to domestic affairs. For Luciano, this shift had profound implications. His assistance during the war had not gone unnoticed, and influential voices began lobbying for his release. Supporters argued that he had rendered invaluable service to the nation, and that his continued imprisonment was both unjust and counterproductive. Thomas Dewey, the very prosecutor who had once sent him to prison, was now governor of New York. Initially resistant, Dewey faced growing pressure from political allies, labor leaders, and even elements within the Navy who credited Luciano with helping the war effort. Dewey ultimately agreed to commute Luciano's sentence, though not without conditions. In January 1946, Luciano was granted parole after serving just 10 years of his 30 to 50-year sentence. But his freedom came at a cost. He would be deported to Italy, never to return legally to the United States. For Luciano, It was both a victory and a defeat. He was free, but the country he had helped shape, the empire he had built, was closed to him forever. As Luciano prepared to leave, he reflected on a decade that had reshaped his life. He had entered prison as the undisputed boss of American organized crime. He emerged 10 years later as a legend, a man whose influence had transcended the bars of Dannemora and reached into the highest levels of wartime strategy. Yet he also faced an uncertain future. Exile in Italy meant rebuilding from scratch, navigating a world where his power would be tested in new and unfamiliar ways. The paradox of Lucky Luciano's wartime years lies in the duality of his role. He was both a criminal mastermind and a reluctant patriot, both a prisoner and a secret ally of the state. His cooperation with the Navy blurred the lines between underworld and government, raising uncomfortable questions about morality, necessity, and the compromises made in times of crisis. When Luciano boarded the ship that would carry him back to Italy in 1946, he was no longer just a gangster. He was a symbol of the Mafia's adaptability, a figure whose life reflected the strange intersections of crime, politics, and war. His exile marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would take him across oceans, into the heart of post-war Europe, and eventually back into the shadows of the underworld he had once dominated. On February 9, 1946, Charles Lucky Luciano stepped off the gangplank of a U.S. military transport ship in Naples, Italy. After serving only a decade of his 30 to 50-year sentence, his release had been engineered through a commutation by Governor Thomas Dewey, with the understanding that Luciano would never again set foot in the United States. For Luciano, the exile was bittersweet. He had won back his freedom, but the price was banishment from the country where he had built his empire, forged the Mafia's modern structure, and cemented his reputation as the most influential gangster of his age. Naples greeted him with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Italy in 1946 was a nation in ruins, devastated by war, occupation, and years of fascist dictatorship. Black markets thrived as people struggled to survive amid shortages of food, clothing, and housing. For a man like Luciano, who had risen from poverty in Naples decades earlier, the conditions felt at once familiar and foreign. He was back in the land of his birth, but he no longer belonged. Italians saw him as an Americanized outsider, a deported criminal sent back against his will. From the moment he arrived, Luciano was under watch. Italian police kept him under near constant surveillance, documenting his movements and contacts. Reporters followed him, curious about the infamous gangster deported from America. The U.S. Embassy in Rome maintained files on his activities, concerned that he might rebuild his criminal empire on European soil. But despite the scrutiny, Luciano's name alone gave him an aura of authority that attracted both legitimate figures and underworld associates. For Luciano, the immediate challenge was to carve out a new role for himself. Though physically cut off from the United States, his network there remained intact. The Mafia Commission still operated, led by men like Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia, who respected Luciano as their founder. Meyer Lansky, ever the strategist, continued to keep him informed about rackets in New York, Havana, and beyond. Letters, coded messages, and intermediaries flowed between Luciano and his allies, ensuring that his voice still mattered in decisions made thousands of miles away. One of the first opportunities to reassert himself came from Cuba. Luciano had long maintained ties with Havana, where American mobsters had invested heavily in casinos, hotels, and the thriving nightlife industry. Lansky, in particular, had transformed Havana into a gambling paradise, with mob-controlled casinos catering to wealthy tourists and Hollywood celebrities. Luciano, eager to escape the confines of Italy and reconnect with his empire, began plotting a return to the Western Hemisphere. In 1946, only months after his release, Luciano arranged to travel to Cuba using forged documents and bribes. He arrived in Havana in secret, setting up residence in the luxurious Hotel Nacional. The city, vibrant with music, gambling, and vice, offered him a stage to demonstrate that he was still the boss of bosses. Almost immediately, a gathering of mafia leaders was convened in Havana, a meeting that would later be mythologized as the Havana Conference. The meeting drew some of the most powerful figures in American organized crime. Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Meyer Lansky all attended, along with representatives from Chicago and other regions. For several days, the mobsters discussed business, from narcotics trafficking to the division of gambling revenues. Luciano presided over the discussions, reaffirming his authority as the man who had created the commission and established order in the underworld. Central to the conference was the question of narcotics. The heroin trade had long been a lucrative but controversial racket within the Mafia. Some bosses opposed it, fearing that drug trafficking brought too much law enforcement attention. But Luciano, pragmatic as ever, recognized the enormous profits to be made. In Havana, he pushed for greater investment in heroin smuggling, arguing that the post-war world offered new opportunities for expansion. With routes stretching from Turkey through Italy and France, heroin could be processed in Europe and shipped to the United States, where demand was rising. For a brief moment, it seemed Luciano had reclaimed his throne. Havana was his stage, the Mafia his audience, and the future of organized crime was once again being shaped by his vision. But his triumph was short-lived. News of Luciano's presence in Cuba reached U.S. authorities. American newspapers began reporting that the deported gangster was living openly in Havana, meeting with Mafia leaders, and exerting influence over U.S. organized crime from abroad. The publicity outraged officials in Washington. The U.S. government pressured Cuba to act. President Harry Truman's administration, already concerned about corruption and organized crime, demanded Luciano's removal. Facing the threat of losing lucrative American trade and tourism, the Cuban government capitulated. In February 1947, barely 3 months after his arrival, Luciano was arrested by Cuban authorities and placed on a ship back to Italy. The deportation to Italy once again placed Luciano in a bind. He had reasserted his authority, but now he was trapped on the margins, watched closely by police and denied access to the country where his syndicate operated. Yet even from exile, he continued to exert influence. Through Lansky, Costello, and others, Luciano's approval still mattered in Mafia affairs. When disputes arose, his opinion carried weight. He was no longer the active boss, but he was still the elder statesman of organized crime. Back in Italy, Luciano settled into a strange existence. He lived in Naples and later in Rome, surrounded by a small circle of loyal associates. Italian authorities harassed him constantly, raiding his home, questioning his visitors, and trying to limit his activities. But Luciano remained resourceful. He built connections with Sicilian Mafia families, many of whom were rebuilding their power after the war. Sicily, like Naples, was fertile ground for black markets, and Luciano saw opportunities to link Sicilian operations with American demand. This was the beginning of what became known as the French Connection. Heroin produced from Turkish opium was processed in laboratories in Marseille, France, and then smuggled into the United States through networks that tied together Corsican traffickers, Sicilian mafiosi, and American distributors. Luciano, with his transatlantic ties, was perfectly positioned to serve as a facilitator. Though the extent of his direct involvement is debated, many historians argue that Luciano played a key role in shaping the global heroin trade during these years. At the same time, Luciano struggled with the reality of exile. Cut off from the nightclubs and skyscrapers of New York, he lived quietly in apartments and villas, his wealth diminished but not destroyed. He entertained visitors, both legitimate and criminal, who came to pay respects. Reporters hounded him, fascinated by the fallen gangster who remained larger than life. Some Italians saw him as a symbol of American corruption exported abroad, while others admired his resilience and cunning. The late 1940s were a time of transition for both Luciano and the Mafia. In the United States, the post-war economic boom fueled organized crime's expansion into gambling, labor racketeering, and drugs. In Italy, the Mafia was regaining strength, exploiting political instability and the Cold War struggle between communism and capitalism. Luciano straddled both worlds, using his connections to remain relevant despite his physical absence from the United States. By 1950, however, the pressure on Luciano intensified. The U.S. government, alarmed by his continued influence, urged Italian authorities to restrict him further. The Italian press branded him a menace, and American officials blamed him for the surge in heroin smuggling. Luciano found himself under near constant police scrutiny, his phone tapped, his mail opened. He was still Lucky Luciano, the man who had built the commission, defied the law, and outlasted his rivals. But he was also a man trapped by geography, age, and relentless surveillance. Even so, Luciano's exile was far from a quiet retirement. He remained a figure of global significance, a man whose name commanded respect in underworld circles from New York to Havana to Naples. His return to Italy had not silenced him, it had transformed him into something new, a transnational broker of organized crime, a living link between the old Mafia of Sicily and the new syndicates of America. As the 1950s dawned, Luciano faced the challenge of maintaining his authority while adapting to a world that was changing rapidly. His exile had not ended his story, it had merely set the stage for a new chapter, one in which the boundaries between continents blurred, and organized crime became a truly global enterprise. By the early 1950s, Charles, Lucky, Luciano had settled into a precarious existence in Italy. Though deported from the United States and under close surveillance by both Italian and American authorities, he remained a figure of immense influence. His exile had forced him to rethink his role in the Mafia, shifting from a hands-on enforcer and strategist in New York to a transnational broker connecting European and American organized crime networks. Luciano's story in these years illustrates the resilience of a man who had once controlled the streets of Manhattan, and who now sought to shape the global underworld from afar. Naples and Rome became his bases of operation. He rented modest apartments compared to his former Manhattan lifestyle, but maintained a degree of luxury and influence that reflected his enduring status. Despite the watchful eyes of Italian police and journalists, Luciano managed to cultivate relationships with both local and Sicilian mafia families. These ties were critical, as Sicily had long been the foundation of his criminal heritage and a key node in the post-war narcotics trade. In Europe, the heroin trade was growing. The French port city of Marseille became the epicenter of heroin production, facilitated by Corsican gangsters who had established processing labs after World War II. Opium sourced from Turkey was refined into heroin in Marseille, then smuggled across the Atlantic to the United States. Luciano, though physically distant from the U.S., was ideally positioned to coordinate and oversee these operations, leveraging his established network of American mobsters who had access to distribution channels. Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese acted as intermediaries, ensuring that Luciano's approval guided decisions in New York and Havana. Luciano's involvement in the heroin trade, sometimes called the precursor to the French Connection, was a blend of strategic oversight and influence rather than hands-on participation. Historians note that while he may not have physically handled shipments, his name lent authority and legitimacy to transactions. Gangsters across continents deferred to him, aware that his approval carried weight. By the mid-1950s, Luciano had become a figure whose reputation alone helped maintain order within the sprawling network of international organized crime. Though he had rebuilt influence abroad, Luciano's life in exile was far from easy. Italian authorities remained vigilant, monitoring his movements and intercepting communications. He was restricted in his travel and kept under periodic surveillance. Moreover, the American government, concerned with narcotics smuggling and the resurgence of mafia influence, continued to pressure Italian officials to limit his activities. Luciano's freedom was, in many ways, conditional, dependent on the delicate balance of diplomacy and discretion. One of the most significant challenges Luciano faced was the changing leadership in the United States. Figures like Vito Genovese, who had once been a trusted lieutenant, began to assert greater independence. Power struggles emerged as American mafia families adapted to the post-war economic boom and the rise of gambling, labor racketeering, and narcotics profits. Luciano had to navigate these dynamics from thousands of miles away, relying on correspondents and emissaries to maintain his authority. While he retained respect, his direct control diminished, illustrating both the limits of influence from exile and the adaptability of the Mafia as an institution. Luciano also faced personal challenges. Living in post-war Italy meant adjusting to a society still recovering from the devastation of World War II. Naples, in particular, suffered from poverty, housing shortages, and social unrest. Luciano, accustomed to wealth and privilege, had to navigate a landscape far different from the opulent nightclubs of Manhattan or Havana. Despite this, he leveraged his American connections to maintain a lifestyle that reflected his enduring status, blending discretion with the symbols of power that had defined his earlier life. The 1950s also brought opportunities. Luciano had long recognized that the post-war world offered new markets and new challenges. European nations were rebuilding, and international trade was resuming, providing avenues for smuggling operations. Luciano explored possibilities in South America, particularly in countries like Venezuela and Colombia, which were becoming hubs for narcotics and illicit trade. Though he did not operate directly on the ground, his guidance influenced the expansion of criminal enterprises in these regions. Luciano's network continued to coordinate with Havana, where Cuban casinos remained a lucrative source of income. He provided counsel on investments and personnel decisions, ensuring that the mob's interests were protected. These operations demonstrated his ability to adapt. Even in exile, he influenced decisions that affected millions in revenue, all while avoiding the direct exposure that had led to his imprisonment years earlier. Despite his influence, Luciano could not escape the vulnerabilities of exile. Italian authorities occasionally raided his residences, prompting him to move frequently and maintain a low profile. Health issues began to surface in the late 1950s, exacerbated by years of stress, imprisonment, and lifestyle choices. While still sharp and capable, Luciano was no longer the physically commanding figure who had once walked the streets of New York with absolute authority. The combination of age, surveillance, and distance from the U.S. underworld began to reshape his role from active boss to elder statesman. Luciano's later years also reflect the tensions between criminal enterprise and international politics. During the early Cold War, the United States sought to counter communist influence in Europe, particularly in Italy. Elements of the U.S. government and intelligence agencies sometimes relied on organized crime contacts for information and influence, echoing the wartime arrangements of Operation Underworld. Luciano, aware of his unique position, navigated these intersections carefully. While he did not act overtly as a government agent, his past cooperation had demonstrated the strategic value of his networks. Socially, Luciano maintained connections with other exiled or transplanted mobsters, as well as legitimate businessmen who recognized the advantages of association with his name. He remained a symbol of the Mafia's global reach, a reminder that organized crime could adapt, survive, and even thrive in the face of legal and political constraints. His life in the 1950s, though physically constrained, was a testament to the enduring power of reputation, relationships, and strategic vision. The global narcotics trade continued to expand in the 1950s, and Luciano's role as a facilitator of the French connection became increasingly important. American law enforcement, still unable to connect him directly to operations on U.S. soil, focused on his subordinates and regional operatives. This allowed Luciano to operate in relative safety while maintaining influence over significant flows of heroin and other illicit goods. Scholars have noted that his oversight helped stabilize the Mafia's international operations, ensuring profits remained high and conflicts minimized. As the decade drew to a close, Luciano faced the dual realities of aging and exile. While he had shaped organized crime in America, built a transnational network, and facilitated one of the earliest global heroin operations, he remained physically distant from the epicenter of power he had once commanded. Yet his influence endured, a reflection of the careful structures and alliances he had put in place years earlier. By the early 1960s, Luciano was a figure who combined legend, fear, and practical authority, a man whose reputation alone influenced decisions across continents. In 1962, Charles, Lucky, Luciano would pass away quietly in Naples, succumbing to a heart attack at the age of 64. Though he died in exile, far from the streets he once dominated, his legacy was undeniable. The mafia he had built, the commission he had established, and the international networks he had fostered outlived him, shaping organized crime for decades to come. The man who had been deported as a criminal, imprisoned as a vice king, and secretly consulted as a wartime asset had, in the end, ensured that his vision for the mafia endured long after his death. Luciano's story, particularly during his years in exile, highlights the adaptability and resilience that made him legendary. While the physical power he wielded in New York could not travel with him, his influence transcended borders. From Naples and Rome, he orchestrated strategies, negotiated alliances, and guided operations that extended from Havana to Marseille to New York. His life in exile exemplifies the enduring reach of organized crime, the intersections between criminality and geopolitics, and the power of networks and reputation. The death of Charles Lucky Luciano on January 26, 1962, marked the end of an era. He passed away quietly in Naples, Italy, at the age of 64, succumbing to a heart attack in his modest apartment. For a man who had once controlled the streets of Manhattan, orchestrated vast criminal networks, and influenced international politics, his death was almost understated. Yet his life's work, building the modern structure of the Mafia, establishing the Commission, and shaping transnational organized crime, endured far beyond his physical presence. The story of Luciano's final years and the lasting impact of his empire illustrates both the resilience of his strategies and the profound influence of one man on organized crime worldwide. Luciano's exile in Italy had already demonstrated his adaptability. From Naples and Rome, he oversaw connections between Sicilian mafia families and the American mob. He monitored narcotics trafficking, provided counsel on disputes within the Commission, and maintained authority over mafia operations in Havana and New York, albeit indirectly. By the time of his death, Luciano had evolved from an active crime boss into a symbolic elder statesman, a figure whose reputation continued to dictate behavior across the underworld. Following his death, the Commission, his greatest creation, continued to operate. Established in 1931 to mediate disputes among mafia families and coordinate criminal enterprises, the Commission had become a blueprint for organized crime governance. Luciano's vision of a structured, cooperative underworld allowed for centralized decision-making without the need for direct oversight. Bosses such as Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello carried forward his principles, ensuring that the system he created could survive even in his absence. In the immediate aftermath of Luciano's death, U.S. law enforcement and the media reflected on his influence. He was remembered as the architect of modern organized crime, the man who professionalized the Mafia and expanded its reach internationally. His ability to combine violence, diplomacy, and strategic foresight made him a model for subsequent generations of mobsters. Historians and criminal analysts have often cited Luciano as the most influential gangster of the 20th century, emphasizing how his innovations, particularly the Commission, redefined organized crime globally. Luciano's work in the heroin trade left a particularly enduring legacy. The French Connection, which he had helped facilitate, continued to funnel heroin from Europe to the United States throughout the 1960s and 1970s. While Luciano himself was no longer active, the networks he had helped establish thrived, proving the effectiveness of his strategy to link European producers with American distributors. Narcotics trafficking became an increasingly significant source of income for the Mafia, cementing its global scope and profitability. In addition to narcotics, Luciano's organizational model influenced other criminal ventures. Gambling, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and extortion, all industries in which the Mafia was involved, benefited from the governance structure he implemented. The Commission ensured that conflicts were mediated, territories respected, and profits maximized. This system reduced violent disputes that had previously plagued the underworld, allowing the Mafia to operate with a level of stability and efficiency that was unprecedented in criminal history. Luciano's legacy also had broader social and political implications. His life illustrated the complex intersections between organized crime and legitimate society. During World War II, his cooperation with the U.S. Navy in Operation Underworld had shown that criminal networks could be leveraged for national security. Later, his transatlantic operations demonstrated the capacity of organized crime to adapt to geopolitical changes, exploit emerging markets, and operate in a globalized context. These lessons shaped law enforcement approaches in the decades following his death, influencing strategies for dealing with organized crime both domestically and internationally. Despite the distance and time, Luciano's influence over Mafia succession remained clear. In New York, Vito Genovese's rise in the 1950s and 1960s reflected the structures Luciano had built. Even when disputes arose between families, the principles of the commission, mediation, consultation, and cooperation guided resolution. Luciano's approach created a culture of obedience to institutional authority rather than personal loyalty alone, a legacy that allowed the Mafia to maintain cohesion through leadership transitions. Luciano's life also shaped public perceptions of organized crime. Media coverage, books, and later films immortalized him as the quintessential gangster, ambitious, ruthless, intelligent, and charismatic. These portrayals emphasized both his criminal ingenuity and his strategic vision, cementing his status as a symbol of organized crime in the American imagination. Unlike gangsters of the 1920s, whose influence was largely localized, Luciano's story highlighted the global reach of organized crime and its capacity to intersect with politics, economics, and international trade. In Italy, Luciano's death did not disrupt the operations he had fostered. Sicilian families, long connected to his American empire, continued to coordinate with U.S. counterparts. His legacy in Naples and Sicily reinforced the enduring transnational nature of organized crime. Police records indicate that even after his death, European and American law enforcement regarded him as a reference point for Mafia operations, demonstrating the lasting impression of his authority and organizational skills. The years following Luciano's death saw the Mafia continue to expand, both in the United States and internationally. His innovations enabled subsequent bosses to diversify criminal enterprises while reducing internal conflict. The heroin trade, gambling operations, and labor rackets all continued to thrive, facilitated by networks that he had helped establish. While Luciano himself never returned to the streets of Manhattan, his fingerprints were evident in every major decision made by the families he had once controlled. Historians often argue that Luciano's most enduring contribution was institutional rather than personal. His genius lay in transforming the Mafia from a collection of competing street gangs into a cohesive, structured organization with mechanisms for dispute resolution, leadership succession, and revenue coordination. By creating a system where power was mediated through the commission rather than brute force alone, Luciano ensured the Mafia's longevity. This institutionalization allowed organized crime to survive challenges from law enforcement, rival gangs, and societal change, leaving a model that persists in various forms to this day. The end of Luciano's life also serves as a reminder of the paradoxes inherent in his existence. He was at once a criminal mastermind and a pragmatic strategist, a prisoner and a wartime asset, an exile and a global broker. His ability to adapt to changing circumstances, from the streets of New York to the prisons of New York State, from Havana's casinos to the alleys of Naples, underscored the breadth of his influence. His story is not merely one of crime but of resilience, strategy, and the ability to navigate complex social, political, and economic systems. Even decades after his death, Luciano's methods influenced organized crime. The commission model was replicated in other cities, and his approach to narcotics trafficking became a template for future international smuggling operations. Law enforcement agencies, from the FBI to European authorities, studied his networks to understand how organized crime could function effectively across borders. In this sense, Luciano's life continued to shape the criminal world long after his passing, proving that his impact was structural as well as personal. In retrospect, Lucky Luciano's death marked both an ending and a beginning. The man who had once dominated New York, revolutionized the Mafia, and influenced global narcotics trade had passed quietly in Naples, but the systems he created endured. His story demonstrates that power in the underworld is not merely about violence or wealth, it is about organization, foresight, and the ability to build institutions that survive beyond the individual. The Mafia of the 1960s, 1970s, and beyond was, in many ways, Luciano's legacy, a testament to his vision and the enduring influence of one of history's most significant figures in organized crime. Lucky Luciano's life remains a subject of fascination because it combines the elements of ambition, strategy, and adaptability with a profound understanding of human networks. From his humble beginnings in Sicily to his rise in New York, his strategic innovations transformed organized crime into a sophisticated enterprise. His exile did not diminish his influence, it merely shifted its form. Even in death, Luciano symbolizes the enduring power of intelligence, organization, and vision in the shadowy world of the Mafia.